and it really means a lot. I mean, just for me as well. So Karin was my PhD mentor and we had a really great time in Australia as well. So I will do an introduction to Dr. Verspoor without any preparation of the paperwork. So Karin had undergraduate double major in computer science and cognitive science at Rice University at Texas. And then she spent some time in the National Library and and also University of Colorado. And before she decided to move to Australia, she took the scientific director at NITA. It's kind of a government institute in Australia. And then starting as an associate professor in the University of Melbourne, where we met. And then together with Professor Justin Zobel, they both become my PhD mentors. And we three have good name rhythms with our initials. Justin Zobel is GZ, Karin Verspoor TV, and Qingyu Chen QC. We have the rhythm. Yeah. We're doing something with data quality in biometric databases for, let's say, duplication or inconsistency identifications, using some of sequence clustering and also with metadata using natural language processing. And then later, enter more into natural language processing with, for example, biocreative challenge tasks for relation interaction. So Karin is no doubt a leading expert in those areas. And then, and also she takes a lot of leadership and as a senior leader in those, in the missions and also like diversity to improve the representations of like disparity groups. Karin recently is also starting like the dean of School of Computing Technology at RMIT. So and today she will present very interesting topic. It's also very relevant to us for large language model for biometric literature extraction, synthesis, and also knowledge discovery. So without any further ado, let's welcome Dr. Verspoor. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Qingyu. It's really a pleasure to be here, and it's really fantastic to see how far Qingyu has come. I met him when he was a baby academic, and he's definitely no longer a baby academic. So really, really wonderful to be here. Yeah, because I know that a number of you in the room are probably working on data-driven methods in biomedicine. I thought I might spend a little bit of time talking about the kind of broader context around the use of AI, natural language processing, machine learning in the context of biomedicine. And most of that work kind of started about, well, more than 20 years ago with the scientific literature. So I wanted to just start there, actually, and give some framing. I actually won't talk during this talk much about our work in the clinical NLP domain, mainly because I wanted to talk about large language models. And in my experience, we don't really need large language models for a lot of the clinical NLP work that we're doing, at least in Australia. So I'm going to focus on the scientific literature side of things. So why do we care about the scientific literature? Well, everything we do in medicine is grounded in evidence, and evidence comes from science, and science is communicated through the literature, right? So we all, in the course of our research, read the papers, right? We go to PubMed, we find the latest research evidence, and we synthesize and integrate that information in order to guide the research that we do next. And in biomedicine, we have different types of evidence, and the literature itself is really considered to be the gold standard of our knowledge, right? It's the way that we present information to each other. And that means that it's really critical that we have good strategies for finding papers, for understanding the evidence base that's out there, and supporting scientific progress. So every time we do science, it's based in previous science, and every research is about pushing the frontier of knowledge, really, around science. And the way we do that is through the literature. So that used to be a not so difficult task, right? Most researchers had a pretty well-defined scope that they were working within, and they could kind of keep up with the scientific literature in their specific research area or their discipline. But that hasn't been the case for quite a long time now. And by the way, you'll notice that my chart here stops at 2020. I kind of gave up updating this graph because the trend is the same. And I just got tired of having to update the numbers all the time. But you know, we can see here that in 2020, when I stopped building this graph, there were about maybe 28 million citations captured in PubMed. Now in 2024, and it's probably gone up since I screenshotted that earlier this year, we have 37 million citations. So just in 4 years, we've seen another growth of almost 10 million citations. So this is massive, right? And it means that paradigm of going into PubMed and putting in a bunch of search terms really isn't working for people. I always like to ask, how many papers a week or a month or a year can you read? What do we think? Maybe 2 papers a week, max, right? So what's that? We have 52 weeks in the year. Let's say, you take a bit of holiday, 100 papers in a year you're reading, at least in depth, right? So how much are you missing because you're not reading? And are you sure you're reading and investing your time and energy into reading the right papers? This assumes that we have tools that allow us to find relevant work. So a lot of my work has been essentially around trying to support scientists to find the information that they need to do their own science. And so that means a number of different kinds of applications, including evidence detection, evidence exploration tools, allowing more open-ended exploration of the literature. I actually won't talk a lot about that particular thing today, but I can if people want to know a little bit more. But importantly, doing synthesis of evidence, because that's one of the key activities in science as well, and ultimately supporting some discovery as well. So we start with organizing knowledge. And one of the things that has been really important certainly in molecular biology, but also driving into human health more broadly, is around trying to organize information in biological databases. So we're capturing facts about proteins and genes and mutations and their connection to disease and so on in large-scale biological databases. And as Qingyu said, his own thesis focused on the quality of those databases. One of the steps in the process of building and maintaining these databases is a job of a biocurator. And the biocurator basically reads papers and extracts facts, concepts, entities, events, and puts them into a structured form in a biological database. Now, this process of biocuration, again, because it's human in the loop and it's driven by humans, is quite slow and methodical. And what we want to do is build tools that can help automate that process. So we have our little robot reader here that's going to help us do that process. Now, once we've taken the core facts and knowledge that's captured in the literature and mapped it into structured representation, this allows us to do better indexing of information, because we can index information in terms of concepts and entities and relationships rather than just keywords. So it opens up different ways of searching, and it enables data analysis to leverage the information. It's much easier, for instance, to do a genome-wide association study, for example, taking advantage of structured information about relationships between genetic changes and disease, than it is to do that using the literature directly, right? We need this sort of intermediate structured representation of the information. It also allows us to support better searching. So once we have the literature kind of represented in terms of concepts and relationships, we can look for those relationships together. And so it means that we can do things like query for papers on a combination of concepts. So here we're saying, okay, find me papers on bariatric surgery in the context of type 2 diabetes with an outcome of remission. Or maybe we want to find papers about a particular drug being metabolized by a particular protein. And if this kind of relational structure aligns to how we're representing the information in the literature, this then facilitates us finding papers that talk about precisely the concepts and relationships that we're interested in. We can also build knowledge graphs that capture those concepts, entities, and relationships. It's all based on the same process, transforming the literature to these structured relationships. And once we have those kinds of graphs, we can do things like literature-based discovery, where we essentially try to connect the dots between information in that graph. So for instance, if we have a paper that connects a particular substance to a particular effect, and we have another paper, a separate paper, that connects a particular effect to a particular disease, then we might hypothesize that there's a connection between that substance and that disease. And this sort of triangulation of information across the literature isn't possible unless we have that integrated view of the information. This was actually a kind of paradigm that was introduced in the 90s by a guy named Swanson. And he actually showed this sort of manually connecting information about fish oil to high blood viscosity platelet aggregation, and then finding another research paper that connected high blood viscosity platelet aggregation to Raynaud's disease. And then he hypothesized that fish oil was connected to Raynaud's disease, and this was then a new scientific question that was generated, and evidence for that was identified. We can do that process at scale now. So thanks to the power of computing, we're not just limited to that kind of very sort of transitive closure around very specific kinds of relationships, but we can do link prediction across this whole massive knowledge graph. And I won't go into details on what we're doing there, but just to give you a sense of what's possible once we start representing the effects and entities and relationships that are in the literature in a computational structural form, rather than just relying on the words themselves or some manual process for getting at that information. One of the key things that we have in biomedicine is, of course, the use of randomized controlled trials to help us understand what the evidence, to generate evidence around particular interventions, typically in a particular population. And I just wanted to point out that most randomized controlled trials follow a very clear structure, which we can see as a relational structure, which lends itself very nicely to this paradigm of transforming words into structured relationships. So the typical clinical question can be framed as what's known as a PICO question, where you're defining a population of interest, an intervention that's being investigated, a comparison or a control group that's defined, and an outcome of interest. And so almost every clinical trial that's published follows this kind of paradigm of where the question that's being examined in the trial is essentially to assess the effects of some intervention compared to some comparison for a condition or problem in a population in some context on outcomes. And so if we can use the power of natural language processing to help us mine through the clinical trial literature and capture the key PICO entities, right? The intervention, the condition, the population, and the outcome, then that provides us with a really powerful way of accessing all the literature around that in that frame, rather than having to think about individual keywords that correspond to this. Another place where we then need to take that evidence and integrate not just information that's in one paper, but across multiple papers, is in the context of systematic reviewing. And so here I've kind of just given a skeletal outline of what a systematic review typically looks like. But essentially, we're taking that PICO question, right, where the healthcare question that we've defined in terms of population intervention, comparison, and outcome. And we're having to do all the steps of science, right? We're doing searching to find the papers that are relevant to that PICO question, which we can facilitate by structuring the concepts and relationships. So we find the studies that are relevant to our question. We look at the outcomes of interest that are specified there. We go through a process of screening titles and abstracts. We can do that more effectively if we have a better tool to help us find the papers in the first place. We check the eligibility and inclusion criteria for our review. And then we do a process which involves not only interpreting the results, so what is the actual finding of each of these studies in relation to the PICO question or the outcome? How do we interpret those results, but also to assess the quality of the evidence around that. And the quality appraisal step in a systematic review is really, really quite critical. But it requires going well beyond just what is the paper about to actually interrogating how strong is the effect that we're observing in the study, and where did the study suffer perhaps from some quality issues. And so we need to really look at not just what is the study about, what is the study finding, but also how well was the study done. And that becomes part of how we bring together the evidence out of varying studies into understanding what the body of evidence says about this particular clinical question. So I'll come back to an example which picks that apart a little bit more in a minute. Okay, so where did we start with all of this? We started with the problem of doing information extraction, where we're trying to map the words in these documents into the structured kind of representation. And so one place we start is just by recognizing the ontology concepts, so biological concepts that are relevant to the facts that we're trying to pull out. So here's an example from a corpus, which, in today's world seems very tiny. We only had 99 full text articles that we worked with in this particular corpus called the CRAFT corpus, Colorado Richly Annotated Full Text Corpus. We spent over 2 years annotating at this very fine-grained level all of the concepts that were described in these 99 articles, and mapping mentions of particular terms to particular ontology identifiers. And then we use this as a foundation for exploring our ability to do this job automatically, right? So we manually annotated all of the ontology concepts as they appeared in the literature, and then tested various methods to do this process automatically. And methods at that time were basically limited to dictionary lookup. I know it sounds crazy, but we did a kind of fuzzy matching of words into our ontology concepts, mainly because, I just told you there were 99 articles, and we had about 2,500 annotations of this type across unique concepts annotated across this literature. So there wasn't enough data there to do machine learning. And just to emphasize a point, like, people think about named entity recognition, and this is a problem that has been studied in natural language processing for a long time. But this problem is quite different from named entity recognition. So in named entity recognition, what we're trying to do is recognize the type of concepts that are appearing in the document. So in this case, you might recognize the word cell as being a cellular component type term, or AQP2 as being a protein, and so on. But contrasting that here, we have much more. It's not just what type of entity we see, but what specific concept is found at that point in the text. And so it's much more fine-grained. The gene ontology, for example, has over 50,000 terms in it. And so mapping into, using machine learning in a space where you have 50,000 labels to choose from is not possible with small data, right? So we have to come up with different strategies. Anyway, so most of that work was done through, let's call it fuzzy dictionary matching. We can do other things with that now, but just to give you a sense of the task we were trying to do there. So moving into relations, then what we're talking about is trying to find more complex interactions between entities or concepts and how they're connected and described to be connected in the text. So we're trying to find things like protein-protein interactions. This protein interacts with that protein. And Qingyu mentioned biocreative. In biocreative, a lot of the work was around trying to basically map from how protein-protein interactions were described in text to a structured representation. So we have an example here. A sentence like cyclin E2 interacts with CDK2 in a functional kinase complex. We can recognize from that sentence that we have a protein-protein interaction. Cyclin E2 is interacting with CDK2. We can map cyclin E2 and CDK2 to ontology identifiers. I've kind of not gone that far in this representation. But furthermore, we can see that that particular interaction then has a downstream association to a particular gene ontology identifier, which corresponds to a polyphosphate kinase complex. And so, what we're really aiming for is to take a sentence like that and convert it into this structured representation, because this is now searchable, right? It's much easier to search for a structured combination of entities than it is to search for all the possible linguistic variations of how that particular interaction might be expressed in text. Just to note that we can then also, by mapping into this concept space, we can also incorporate knowledge. So if we know things such as benazepril is an ACE inhibitor, if we see a sentence like ACE inhibitor treats hypertension, then we can make an inference that benazepril probably is useful for treating hypertension. And so we can by mapping into this kind of structured ontology space, we can leverage the hierarchical information that's implicit there as well. So moving into that structured representation really opens up a lot of reasoning opportunities. Okay, so how do we do this? I mentioned a lot of the concept recognition work was based on kind of dictionary mapping, but even quite early on, and this is work that I did more than 10 years ago with a research fellow named Haibin Liu. Moving into the relation space, it's really about language, right? It's really about what are the words that connect entities together. And so we looked at the linguistic structure of text. Here's just a simple phrase: seizures were caused by alcohol and fatigue. What we're trying to do there is understand that there is a causal connection between seizures and alcohol, right? Or also fatigue. And so, we read a sentence like that, and our linguistic brains understand that this is communicating a particular relationship. And so we built on that insight to essentially drive learning of the patterns, the linguistic patterns that corresponded to the types of relations that we were trying to extract. And so we built a machine learning, a supervised learning system, which utilized mapping of the sentences into this linguistic structure called a dependency structure, dependency graph structure, and actually does graph mapping in order to learn the patterns, the linguistic patterns that correspond to the types of relationships that we're aiming to extract. As the kind of methods have evolved, more recently we were looking at using LSTM modeling. to help us do both the entity recognition and the problem of trying to connect those entities together in relations. And so again, using supervised learning, trying to capture the broader structures around and incorporate named entity recognition and relation classification into a single end-to-end model. This was work that we did maybe was published 2019. I think we were doing in 2018. Really trying to again leverage the data and move us towards models that could understand the linguistic structure, but using more of the kind of sequence models that were becoming available at that time. We can use a similar paradigm now moving into the world of word embeddings. As pre-trained models started to become available, we can leverage those for representation and view the relation extraction task as a classification task. So trying to understand in the context of a sentence, you know, can we learn, can we train a model that can recognize particular kinds of relations? In this particular work by my student Biayang Fang, he was looking at co-reference and bridging relationships, which are a particular kind of relationship that we were interested in his project. But I just wanted to kind of give a sense of the methodological evolution that's been happening over the last 20 years. Okay, so now the obvious next step in 2024 is to be thinking about large language models, right? So can we leverage not just pre-trained models, but these, you know, let's call them uber huge large language models, and also looking at the generative capabilities. And I'm sure most of you have to have been living under a rock not to have heard of ChatGPT. So yeah, like I'm just going to assume that everybody knows what ChatGPT is. Yeah, probably all of you are using it, right? So the question is, you know, can we leverage the power of large language models to do some of these information extraction tasks and to help us navigate all of this amazing resource that we have in scientific literature. So we did I did some work along with an honor student named Melindi. I'll show you her picture in a second, where we were working on a data set that was released earlier this year called GenoVar-DIS, which was trying to capture particular entities, and there were this was just particular entities, so this is a named entity recognition task, trying to identify genes, genetic mutations, and diseases. But the twist in this particular one, this sort of genetic variation extraction task has been tackled in a number of cases. But in this case, we were trying to do it in Spanish. Now, there's not a lot of annotated data available for Spanish. And so we thought, okay, what would happen if we just tried to use a large language model, which has in principle encoded both English and Spanish and various other languages into it? And can we get it to do this information extraction task? So to take the Spanish text and identify all of these particular entities that are mentioned there and map them to particular locations in the text. So, you know, Melindi is an undergraduate student, so we didn't need to necessarily do anything hugely complicated methodologically. We're like, let's just try to prompt the large language models and see whether we can get this to work. And so Melindi designed a set of experiments that were really around trying to explore what kinds of prompting strategies would be useful for us to try to solve this problem. So we have we had some annotated data in the form of the GenoVar-DIS training set that was made available, and we experimented with few shot learning. So how many shots, how many examples should we put in the prompt in order to drive this? What kind of guidelines should we give it? And how should we prompt it? Should we use English as the prompting language or Spanish as the prompting language? And, you know, like maybe we can think about what hypothesis we might give. A show of hands, who thinks that if we prompt the system in the same language as the text is written in, that we should get better results? That was my hypothesis too. I thought, let's prompt in the same language. That's going to put the language model in the right space. Well, I'll tell you in a minute what happened. So, the structure of the prompting that we did, and this was, essentially the framework for all the different variations of the prompts that we experimented with. We either gave an annotation guideline or not, gave some definitions, having examples, the few shot from 0 to 10. Was the instruction language in English or in Spanish? I'm showing English here just to keep it simple. What kind of output format should we expect? We learned pretty quickly that the meta knowledge in these LLMs is pretty poor. So actually asking it to identify the particular spans of text. So where exactly the term is in the text, that really didn't work at all. It doesn't know how to count offsets into the text, doesn't understand that concept. So we moved on from that pretty quickly. And then, of course, the text that needs to be annotated itself. Okay, so if you look at this, probably a bit hard to unpack. Some of the key takeaways from this were that essentially more prompts is mostly better. Certainly you need at least 5 prompts to 5 examples in the prompt to get the best sort of performance. But if you compare the right hand to the left hand, so Spanish versus English in that example, we actually found that the English prompts work better overall than the Spanish prompt, which is kind of interesting. Because I think it probably, as your show of hands showed, like your intuition is that the language of the prompt should match, or the language of the instruction should match the language of the text. But in this case, there's more knowledge somehow around the instruction in English than there is in Spanish. And so because of probably superficial similarities, I mean, Spanish is fairly similar, at least in terms of how the words describe biomedical concepts and these genetic concepts. So yeah, anyway, in this particular case, it seemed that the English prompts were working better. So one interesting thing that we found was, of course, the issue, once you're dealing with generative models, you have the problem of hallucinations. Now, hallucinations actually didn't impact our precision and recall very much because we were, remember, ignoring the positions of the entities in the text. So we had, in order to get the positions of the entities in the text, as a secondary post-processing step, we had to map them back into the text. We had to project them into the text. And so we could immediately throw hallucinations away because they didn't match any spans in the text. Which is a nice benefit of having the text that you need to annotate, right? We can always, since our task is to find the entities in the text, if the system generates an entity that's not in the text, we can immediately identify it as a hallucination. But we were curious about, what types of hallucinations we were seeing. And it turned out that we had 2 different types of hallucinations. One was what we're calling overgenerated hallucinations. So basically, the model would output more instances of a term than were actually present in the text. So if we go back to, oops, the wrong way, sorry. If we go back to this, it might have output osteoma maxillar 4 more times than actually occurred in the text. And so there was a lot of that, that basically, it had recognized that NF1 was a gene that was mentioned in the text. And then it would tell us that there were, 20 instances of NF1 instead of just 2, or what have you. So that was one kind of hallucination. And the other kind of hallucination was the more typical fabricated hallucinations, where you have entities that are in the output that are just not mentioned in the text anywhere at all. And if we look at the outputs from our experiments, we were able to distinguish between these two things automatically. And it turned out that most of the problem was, in fact, fabricated instance. So that's, gives you some questions around maybe whether you should be using LLMs. And I will say, I didn't compare with the more fine-tuned and supervised models. But if you look overall, our precision recall F-score for this task isn't very high. So it's 0.5-ish is the best performance that we found. And so just straight prompting-based strategies for doing this information extraction task in this particular context are just not working very well. You get much higher results, more like 0.9, if you use some sort of fine-tuning or supervision in the training process. So it was an interesting experiment. I don't think I would be advocating throwing away our traditional methods at all. Okay, I'm going to move on to the evidence synthesis case, and what I want to demonstrate here is that this process of synthesizing information across multiple sources, like we have in a systematic review context, is quite a complex process. We haven't gotten to the point of actually experimenting with Gen AI for this particular step. And I think we're actually quite far away from it. And so that's essentially what I want to communicate to you now. Because if I started off telling you about PICO questions, and so here you can imagine that we're doing a systematic review around aliskiren lowering blood pressure. So we're trying to understand, does this drug lower blood pressure? And when we have multiple studies that all examine this particular clinical question, you will find statements like I've shown up here. So aliskiren lowers blood pressure. It may lower blood pressure. It does not lower blood pressure. There's not enough evidence to decide whether it lowers blood pressure. And of course, framing statements like it is important to establish if aliskiren lowers blood pressure, which says nothing. But if all you're doing is a keyword search around aliskiren lowering blood pressure, you can find that all of these papers that have these varying statements are relevant to the clinical question, but they don't actually help you to make a decision about whether or not to use this drug. And so when we're looking at these kinds of statements, we have to look at the kind of building blocks of the statements that are in the text and go beyond just the words, right? We need to understand, okay, yeah, what are the entities? What are the concepts that are mentioned here? What is the direction of the finding that we're looking at? That creates a proposition. So we have a question plus a direction. And then we need to look at the modality. Is this confirmed? Is it a maybe? What's the sort of the strength of the finding? And if there is no modality, like the last example, it is important to establish, then there is no claim. And so we have to have a system that can understand these different levels of claiminess, I guess you could call it, in order to really support the systematic reviewing. And we start by trying to synthesize information around the PICO questions. So trying to look at essentially mapping different studies into that question. This is kind of the easiest thing we need to do in the context of systematic reviewing. But if we go a little bit deeper, then we start to ask questions like, well, what does it mean to combine information together? So key thing in systematic reviewing is to do meta-analysis. You need to bring together the different findings of these different studies. And so, talking about apples and oranges here, apples, oranges, and pears, think about how we can effectively combine information. So if our input documents have a bunch of apples, a couple of oranges, and a pear, how do we merge that information together? Now, there are some strategies for doing that. So we can write a sentence that says something like, this paper says that aliskiren lowers blood pressure, and that paper says that it increases blood pressure, and this other paper isn't sure, right? So that's one way. That's not such a great strategy because we haven't actually synthesized anything. We've just listed it out. Another way of doing it is to take the majority. Okay, so in our example, the majority are apples. And so we might just say, okay, the literature tells us that Alice lowers blood pressure. Again, not very nuanced, right? It doesn't really consider all of the variation that's out there. So some better strategies would be, and this is what we do when we're doing critical analysis, when we're doing our literature review, is to really think about, kind of the weight of evidence around different things. So we could add some contrasting statements. Some say orange, while others say apple, and some say pear. Or we could synthesize and say, well, actually, the weight of the evidence is orange, even though quantitatively there are more apples than oranges. On the other hand, what do we say when there's no evidence? Like, is there just too much conflict? How do we decide that? What if there's weak evidence or no evidence at all? And aggregating weak to moderate to strong, these are all questions. And so this is actually a really hard task for people to do, right? And if we're trying to get a system that's going to automate some of this, it's perhaps going to be challenging. And that's really the point of what I wanted to share, is just to get you thinking about what's involved or what would be involved to do this kind of evidence synthesis in a meaningful way. I don't think we're there yet. We're not there yet with supervised tools, and we're definitely not there yet with generative tools. Okay, so another place that we've been working, and this is work by a research fellow, Simon Schuster, is looking at a particular step in the quality assessment, quality appraisal process of systematic reviewing called risk of bias assessment. And this has been approached using supervised methods many times. Byron Wallace at Northeastern University is probably the most well-known for work around this. He built a system called Robot Reviewer. And essentially, the idea is to train a classifier that can leverage the information in the literature to build an assessment of whether there's high risk of bias or low risk of bias in a particular study. And so Simon decided that he would try to prompt large language models to do this risk of bias assessment process, mainly because we now have a new version of the risk of bias tool called Risk of Bias 2. They're very creative in their naming. But the Risk of Bias 2 tool doesn't have any annotated data or very little annotated data available. And so this kind of supervised learning paradigm is challenging. So, okay, we're not limited to supervision anymore. We can use large language models to help us, right? So Simon devised this prompting strategy where we, on the one hand, are giving kind of more specific instructions. So in this case, we're using something called signaling questions, which are specific questions that are asked in the context of determining risk of bias for particular studies. So we use a signaling question to trigger a question-specific instruction and provide the text. We can also just go straight to predicting risk of bias directly. So basically ask the model to determine the risk of bias directly. And we give it some instructions which help it to understand what risk of bias is, but don't go to that finer grained level of the signaling questions. Long story short, it doesn't work. So the LLMs basically are getting F scores again around 0.5 at that binary classification level. So binary classification, we should be getting way better than 0.5, right? Because random is basically 0.5. I mean, it's not quite because the data's imbalanced, but the overall F score for the LLMs is basically on par with some pretty trivial baselines. So yeah, there's not a lot more to tell you except that this was true whether or not we use the generic kind of large language models or more medically oriented ones that would presumably have more understanding of the particular kind of text that we were dealing with. And whether we do few-shot learning or prompt simplification really didn't make any difference at all. So it doesn't work. I'm running out of time. Sorry, I'm talking too much. I'm going to run through some further examples just to kind of give you a sense of the sorts of problems that we can run into when we're trying to leverage generative LLMs. And this is all work done by various different students of mine. So I have a student that's working on preclinical animal studies and trying to extract interventions from the text. The story here is basically that, again, the large language models really don't do very well. When we couple them with filtering using regular expressions, yeah, remember those? We actually get better performance, although still not good. My student Tin is working on negation. Negation is extremely important in the context of biomedical data, particularly clinical data. And we find that the language models essentially don't see negation. Negation is a little tiny word, not, no. It's extremely prevalent. So if we think about it in terms of the distribution, how, you know, where does negation words appear? They can appear in any kind of context. So any context specificity doesn't really help us there. And even just doing simple inversion of multiple choice question, literally the models don't see them. They are getting better. Okay, so a lot of this work was done in the early days of the LLMs, and they are improving. But you know, this simple example here, like, you know, you invert the question, you get exactly the same answer. This was something that Tin was able to demonstrate was pretty systematic. Just essentially, large language models were not seeing the negation at all. There's some fun examples that you can look at, which go a little bit further into reasoning. Does a man owns a dog entail that a man owns an animal? Yes, a man owns a dog entails a man owns an animal. Great. Okay, does a man does not own a dog entail a man does not own an animal? Yes, a man does not own a dog entails a man does not own an animal. Not true. Okay, thanks, LLM. And you know, more quantitatively, Tin looked at essentially the performance of the large language models in the context of natural language inference, which hinges on reasoning, and looked specifically at instances that involve negation in some way, and basically found that most of these models are actually below chance, performing below chance, so not seeing negation. So if we move to more capable models, they are doing better with negation understanding, but arguably still leave substantial room for improvement. So I think for us in the context of clinical data in particular, where numbers are so important, we might have some significant concerns. We can do the same game in the context of numbers. So numbers also extremely important. My student Ramad is working on this. And you know, he's been looking at it in general, but it was all motivated and inspired by our work on clinical trials data. And he's, you know, he's really looking at reasoning and basic, progressing from basic arithmetic through to number comparison, through number normalization. And models really struggle with a lot of these tasks. So here are some numbers. Again, some pretty low performing results when you hone in on particular inference tasks that involve numbers. More numbers here. These numbers are a little bit better. So it just, you know, it does depend on what specific task you're looking at and which particular language models you're working with. Some are obviously tuned to a little bit better. But just to give a sense of how important this is, when Ramad looked at a couple of biomedically oriented data sets, the evidence-based medicine NLP corpus has about 90% of the abstracts contain numerical information, and only 13% of those are within a picospan, so within a population intervention or an outcome span. It's mostly around the inclusion-exclusion criteria for particular studies. And we see that absolutely in the clinical trials data. 100% of patient descriptors contain numerical information, including age information, vital signs, lab results, and so on. And so we really have, some challenges ahead of us, because if we want to be able to make inferences like most patients in cohort 1 suffered a cardiac event, we have to be able to look at the data that we have. So here we have an example. You have to be able to interpret terms like most. You have to be able to aggregate numbers together. You have to be able to do inequality reasoning. And in this case, we want that statement not to be supported. So the inference is, no, that statement is not true given the data. But in order to get there, you need to do quite a lot of processing. The models really kind of struggle a bit to work with the mathematical information, and particularly around inference and reasoning to do with numbers, which are really, really important in the context of our data. Okay, so basically, I think the key conclusions, hopefully, that I've communicated to you is that we need NLP, right? We need natural language processing to help us make sense of all of this data. We're not quite there yet in terms of using generative LLMs. Of course, we should keep trying. And I think if we have some more targeted strategies for using LLMs in these contexts, we will see improvements along these lines. But there's some really quite complex reasoning and inference tasks that are involved with our scientific evidence analysis that are not as easy as they look. So I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
A lot, Karin. That's a really wonderful talk with all the studies. Very interesting. Any questions?
Okay. So thanks for your impression and a very insightful presentation. So you in your presentation you already show that large language models in many tasks like entity recognition and evidence-based task show its limitation like hallucination and reliability. So regarding to further improve these models reliability, do you have any suggestions or ideas? Because we actually already, for example, try to improve these models reliability by developing medical specific large language model by using domain-specific data for continued pre-training or fine-tuning this general domain model. But actually these problems still exist. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts about it?
So, I mean, I think obviously we started with just trying to understand the limitations, right? And I think there's not quite enough evidence yet. Like most people are so gung-ho about using them, they're not really asking what are the limitations. So I think we want, that's part of the purpose of this work is to kind of, just dig a little bit deeper beyond. But in terms of how we can mitigate some of this, you mentioned fine-tuning. So I think fine-tuning is a huge part of this. I actually think that having some fairly task-specific strategies will help us to improve. So combining the best of both worlds, right? Leveraging the representational power of the large language models, but then also really doing some targeted fine-tuning for specific tasks. And I think we're going to end up with ensembles of models. So we're not just going to have a one-size-fits-all, just put everything in your prompt, rely entirely on the prompt. We're going to have solutions to particular problems or to particular information needs that are involving multiple kind of steps. So we're probably going to have a numerical reasoning system which understands numerical reasoning. We're going to have a different system that deals with negation. And in fact, some of Tin's work has really been oriented around what you can do on the data side. So you can improve the performance of the LLMs by having contrasting examples on the training side. But we need to understand what problems we need to do that for before we can invest time and energy into doing it. So I think it's going to be a combination of, more evolved training strategies that are tuned to particular tasks, some fine tuning, and then having essentially ensembles of models that are going to be working together to solve these bigger problems.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thanks very much.
Any further questions? You don't need to travel for 20 hours to go to Australia to ask.
That's true.
Oh, online, okay, yeah. Can you talk this? Zach?
Sure. So Pradeep online asks, can LLMs tell us what proportion of papers about LLMs are based on the principle to someone with a hammer, everything looks like a nail?
Very funny. The answer is no, because as I said, they have no meta-knowledge. So LLMs understand the notion of an LLM because other people have written about LLMs, but they don't actually understand LLMs, right? Remember, as one of my favorite people, Emily Bender, likes to say, these systems are just stochastic parrots, right? They're just parroting back to us the text that has been fed into them. And I think, look, I'm perhaps a little bit controversial, but I don't actually believe in the sparks of intelligence line of argument around LLMs. I think that they are extremely good pattern matching machines, but the inference and reasoning capabilities are really still quite questionable.
Have you tried the recent O1?
I haven't. Yeah, I guess I always have this challenge, right? And look, any example you put up. So I've had this like running suspicion for well, pretty much since ChatGPT came out, that every time somebody posts an example where one of these models fails, they go in and just basically hack it, right? They go in and change their reinforcement learning to target these particular examples, put in some guardrails, hack in some whatever. And we've certainly seen that on the side of giving medical information. They've put guardrails in now, right? And I have a colleague who works at Google. He works at a major technology company. We might want to wipe that from the recording. And he has confirmed to me that they have teams of people that basically troll social media for these examples and then go in and just hack them. So, I mean, yeah, we have to be aware that, yes, these things are moving targets, but part of what we're seeing in the output is not necessarily a reflection of more intelligent models. So, yeah, O1, I actually haven't played with it. I know it's supposed to be much better. I guess I would love for people to properly interrogate some of these things. And, the negation data sets, we've made a test suite available. You can do benchmarking. So I think, we should start to do this. But really, I think we should all be approaching these systems with a very critical lens and try to view it, as we do everything else in science, really, really ask the questions of okay, what's actually working well and what's not actually working well? And where might they have hacked it? Because the medical board examination stuff, sort of feel like it's all in the training data. Correct. Yeah. So yeah, and that's the problem. If we can't look at these things scientifically, it's very difficult to actually know what the models have learned versus what the models have seen.
Okay. So if you have any follow-up questions or you're interested in reading Karin's studies, please do contact Karin, and also just to share with you a fun fact. So Karin's PhD thesis is probably one of the highest cited PhD thesis. I think it's around 300 citations, and it's for context-dependent lexical semantics. And after a decade, there's some context-dependent language model called transformers of BERT come out. So it's
I actually, thank you, Qingyu. I have told people, I was like, I was working on contextually dependent word meaning long before it was cool.
Yes.
And I kind of feel, that was just for context, my PhD was written in 1997. So yeah, I kind of feel like things have come full circle a little bit, but the way I approached it then was very much with a linguistic lens and trying to really examine how we needed to represent word meaning in order to explain some of the very interesting linguistic phenomena we have around how words can change meaning in context. You shouldn't have to read my thesis anyway, but yeah, it is funny how everything that's old becomes new again.
JLPs. So anyway, just wondering. Well, I had.
Let's thanks Karin again. Thank you for joining us today. Thanks.
Thank you so much.